Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. Thank you for joining us. We're running a few minutes behind here, so we'll just get right into it. I welcome you all to the third WHERE webinar of the day, Diversity Wins, How Inclusion Matters. Thank you to those who have joined us along the way, whether for the first or second or both of the past two sessions today, and to those who are just joining us for the first time. We just like to, have in the chat, if you just want to gets everybody getting used to using the chat, to type in where you're from, so we can just have a general sense of where everybody's coming at us from. I am Candace Best. I am based in Toronto. I run a boutique PR firm serving mission-driven brands with sustainability measures baked into what they do to create impact for a sustainable future. I'm also a proud board member of Fashion Takes Action, and it gives me great pleasure to be here today with you as host of this edition of the WHERE series, which is a monthly series that happens, like all other things at FTA, under the leadership of the organization's founder and executive director, Kelly Drennan. To start, I want to acknowledge that the land that I'm standing on today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto is built on sacred land that is part of an agreement between Indigenous peoples and allied nations to peacefully and respectfully care for it. We share this acknowledgement because it is evident that the colonial structures used to once settle this land are the same systems that support the exploitation of resources and people in the global fashion industry today. We at FTA are making an effort to dismantle these colonial structures by providing platforms like WHERE that give a voice to the people who are being exploited and acknowledge the need to prioritize respect for both the land and the people involved in making our clothes. Before we dive into our final and third session of the day, I'd like to thank our generous sponsors, BDC, the Business Development of Canada, and Stringer LLP, whose support allows us to offer these sessions to you at little to no cost. There will be sort of a Q&A session at the end, so please feel free to use the Q&A function at the base of your screen to pose any questions you would like to pose to the speakers, and you can feel free to sort of populate the Q&A section along the way as we go along. Please only use the chat function for sharing links or to share enthusiasm about anything that may be said. You can also upvote a question by liking it, which will pop it up to the top of the list and allow us to prioritize in the event that we get several questions. So the theme, as those of you know, who obviously by being here and having registered for this month's WHERE series, is equity, diversity, and inclusion in fashion. We believe that an integral component of sustainability is to embrace diverse communities and the unique voices they support. Today, we have been hearing from some of the voices that have been in the shadows, and we're here to shine a spotlight on those who are leading change. We have been learning how we can help to dismantle the existing colonial framework and rebuild a culture of inclusivity in fashion. This, our third and final session, focuses on how inclusion matters and why diversity wins. Led by Mukani Moyo, a partner at McKinsey Co, this presentation will demonstrate the benefits of having a diverse executive team and how companies can adopt a business strategy that not only encourages a more diverse and inclusive workplace, but indeed propels it. We're so excited to have Mukani Moyo here today to lead us through this important discussion anchored in sound data by McKinsey. Mukani Moyo is a partner at McKinsey Co and part of McKinsey's basic materials practice here in Toronto, where I am. He serves mining clients around the world on a range of topics, primarily in operations, procurement, capital productivity, and strategy. His work focuses on helping mining companies successfully deliver large-scale performance transformations, safely improving productivity and financial performance. He is a lead author of McKinsey's research on productivity in the mining industry, captured in the Mining Productivity Index, also known as the MPI. Mukani also leads internal and external efforts on expanding diversity and inclusion in particular on topics relating to improving racial equity and representation. Mukani holds a degree in electrical and computer engineering from the University of Cape Town and an MBA from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Mukani, we are so thrilled to have you here with us today to share all your knowledge and insights, and I put it over to you, Mukani.
Wow, thank you so much, Candace, and appreciate that kind introduction. And thank you all. Good afternoon, good morning, I guess, depending on what time zone you're in and where in the world you are. It's a real pleasure to be speaking with you today about this really important topic, and coming as it is in the month of February, which is Black History Month, the time that we recognize and acknowledge the contributions of our Black and diverse communities across this country in their contributions in this nation's history. As Candace shared, I'm a partner with McKinsey. I am based here in Toronto and do my work pre-COVID, traveling around the world, working from home now, and I trust you're all keeping safe wherever you are. And a little bit about what I do on the diversity front. I lead, as Candace shared, our work on diversity and inclusion, in particular focused on our inclusion efforts focused on our MBN community. That's our McKinsey Black Network. And so, what we're talking about here today is something that I'm personally very passionate about. I'll segment this conversation into three main sections today. First, I'd love to open up with a bit of a pop quiz, share a few questions to help us calibrate on what our baseline or starting point is in Canada. Would love to get your reflections. Then would love to change gear and talk about why diversity matters. And here, we'll be sharing with you the results of some work we've done over the last several years, bringing some analysis to this topic to understand why diversity matters and what it means for those businesses that are able to ingrain it in their organizational DNA. I will also share some suggestions for what companies can do across a range of industries to advance these topics. And then lastly, would love to save some time to hear from you. So we'll have a bit of Q&A at the end. And as we go along, if you have questions or things that pop up, please do use the chat function. Without further ado, let us get into it. I'm just going to put something up that we can look at. And I'm going to start with a few questions. We could get the poll up. All right. All right, you should be able to see these polling questions. Could someone just give me a quick thumbs up or link in the chat to let me know you can see this? Excellent. So the first question for you, suspension rates in schools across Canada. The statement is, suspension rates in schools, are these equal across all races? True or false? Let's get your thoughts on that one. Okay. You see the second question then is, which statement is true about Canada's pre-COVID job market? And segmenting pre-COVID, so we know there have been some significant changes as a result of the pandemic that's roiling the world. So the first statement there is, unemployment rates for Black and white Canadians are roughly equal. Second statement is, Black women had a significantly higher rate of unemployment than Black men. The third statement is that Black men and Black women in Canada had a much higher rate of unemployment than white Canadians. Okay. And then there's a third question, which statement is true about the racial income gap in Canada as it relates to educational attainment? First response is, higher levels of educational attainment help Black Canadians close the income gap to that we see in similarly educated white Canadians. Second statement there is, education makes no difference to the income gap between Black Canadians and white Canadians. And then third statement is, as their level of educational attainment increases, Black Canadians face an even bigger income gap relative to white Canadians. So I see about 70% vote completion. We'll give it a little bit more. Ten more seconds. Okay, so I'm going to end that poll and let us share the results of that. Okay. Are you all able to see this? So on the first question, suspension in schools equal among races, 100% of you said that that is false. Interesting. We'll see some facts on that in a second. And then on the second question, which statement is true about Canada's pre-COVID job market? About 40% of you reckon, 43% of you reckon that Black women, the correct answer was B, that Black women have a significantly higher rate of unemployment than Black men. And then the majority of you think that Black men and women had a much higher unemployment rate than white Canadians. Okay. And then the third question, that one is interesting. It seems like there's a bit of a split in the answers here. About a third of you think that high levels of educational attainment help Black Canadians close the gap. About a 10th of you think that education makes no difference. And then about 2/3, just under 2/3 of you think that the gap actually grows as educational attainment increases for Black Canadians. Interesting. I'm gonna put up a few slides now. I'll just share my screen to get us into this. So on the first question, most of you got this right. Indeed, we do see significant disparity in rates of suspension in the schooling system. This what you're seeing here specifically is in Ontario and in the Peel region from data a couple of years ago, and it shows that Black students were just over 2.5 times more likely than non-Black students to be suspended for schools, including for identically the same incidents or the same sets of things. So it does show that there's been there is a material gap by race in how kids experience the school system. The second question on the income gap. So if you think about, these young kids going through the school system and then one day entering the job market, we see a couple of things. First of all, in terms of unemployment rates, which is the likelihood of people finding a job, Black Canadians have a significantly higher rate of unemployment than white Canadians. In this case, we're showing you the comparison relative to white men. There is indeed a difference. It is not that big between Black men and Black women, but significantly higher than for their white Canadian counterparts. And when, on the right-hand side, they do find a job, you see this significant income gap relative to their white peers, 34 to 44% difference relative to white men for Black men and Black women, respectively. So that is a very substantial income gap. And what is interesting is that as you look at that as educational attainment increases, counterintuitively, so this was a bit of a surprise for us, is that that gap actually widens. You might have expected that as educational attainment increases, there'd be some leveling of this field. But actually, we see that no, as folks enter the job market, those with the least education, there's about a 16% delta in the income level between Black and white Canadians that don't have any sort of educational certificate beyond high school. That gap for those that have a college certificate is 18%, and it grows to 28% for those that have a bachelor's degree or higher. And that speaks to potentially a number of drivers. Is potentially something to speak of in terms of, in the first place, getting into the hurdles that Black Canadians face getting into the market, but also as they advance their careers. And some of that may be due to them stagnating in lower roles and not growing into the more higher paying jobs in whatever industry they're in. When we actually cut that across different industries, this is using data from the most recent Statistics Canada report from a few years ago, we see that that gap varies across industries, but the biggest discrepancies, to the point I was making a couple of moments ago, is in those management roles. So it does speak to something around advancing professionally and being able to take on, seeing promotions and seeing their careers grow, the hurdles that Black Canadians face there. And it's substantial gaps. And if you compound that over a professional career and over a lifetime and think about the compounding effects of that across generations and the things across one's life stages they're able to do, these gaps are substantial and compound. So that was a few reflections I wanted to share to help us anchor in on where Canada stands and what the facts are for the Black Canadian experience as it relates to education and professional experiences. And one of the reasons that I wanted to share that with you is to give us a bit of a baseline, as we reflect on how the racial discourse has unfolded, in particular in the last 8-9 months or so, with the crescendo that built up on this topic following the tragic murder of George Floyd in the US. There can sometimes be a perception or sense that, well, that's a problem that the States has. Canada is different, and maybe things aren't quite as bad as they are in the US. And while that may be true in terms of some of the most egregious racial experiences tied to violent attacks and crime and so on, when we do look at the day-to-day lived experience, we look at the professional opportunities and the things that really matter from a generational perspective, we do find that there are indeed elements to address in Canada. So just a few reflections. I'd now like to turn to why this even matters and why we believe diversity is the important topic that we believe it is. And it's very important in this context to acknowledge where we are in the world right now with this COVID pandemic roiling the world as it is. And I think the message here is that diversity matters now, perhaps more than ever, given the dislocations that we've seen, as well as the compounding effects that these can have across communities and societies. We believe that inclusion and diversity matters more than ever and may in fact be a critical strategic lever for companies to distinguish themselves versus their competition. So this can indeed be a strategic pillar for responding to the crisis. No doubt, many will think that today at a time of crisis is, just really about survival, and in that lens, inclusion and diversity may be a casualty of the crisis. We're already seeing the disproportionate impacts that the crisis is having on minority communities and diverse communities, with certain industries being hit more than others. So for example, the clerical industry, the retail space, hospitality, which tend to have more minority representation. There are indeed additional trends like automation that, as a result of the crisis, those trends may accelerate and could also have disproportionate impact on women and minorities as well. So all of these factors may get worse. But what we find in our work is that those companies that embrace inclusion and diversity could emerge stronger from this crisis for a variety of reasons, whether that's because of the opportunity that they take advantage of in using remote working to tap into high talent value pools that they haven't in the past, or because of the fact that they can use more diverse companies tend to do a better job of anticipating what their consumers' preferences may be over time. So being more attuned to those shifting consumer preferences and dynamics, or being able to better tap into the magic of innovation, building a more inclusive environment that it results in a culture that's more agile, ultimately enabling them to respond quicker to the variety of threats that we're seeing in various reasons to do that. So as McKinsey, we've conducted detailed research on this topic, and to do so, we built, to really understand what the link is between diversity and the performance of businesses. And to do that, we built a rather large data set we could go in and analyze, get some rigorous insights from that comprises more than 1,000 companies from around the world, 20 countries represented in there. When the first report came out, there were 4, and we've been growing it over the last several years. So, the point that now it's just over 1,000 companies, 20 different countries, spanning a wide variety of industries. What we wanted to do here was to understand what the link is between how these companies perform and the level of diversity that they have. So this is the data set that we have. And the results from our analysis are compelling. And let me explain what we're seeing here. In short, what we find is that those companies that are the most diverse significantly outperform their peers financially. And so that really just builds the message that there is a robust business case for this topic. And let me explain what you're seeing on this chart. In the top half, we see the link between gender diversity and financial outperformance over time. And in 2014, when we first published this report, that report, by the way, was titled Why Diversity Matters. We found that those companies that were in the top quartile of gender diversity were 15% more likely to outperform those that were in the bottom quartile of gender outperformance. So that's that first bubble you see on the top left. And by the way, our measure of outperformance in this case is in EBIT margins, so a measure of financial profitability. By the time of our second report in 2017, that gap had grown to 21%. And as of our most recent report, which is in 2019, that gap had widened to 25%. In the case of ethnic minority, you see a similar theme. What stands out is that there's an even bigger gap in that likelihood of financial outperformance. So in 2014, it was 35%, and it's grown slightly to 36% by 2021. So very clear and simple message. Those companies that are more gender and ethnically diverse outperform or are more likely to outperform their peers that are not. When we break this down into, looking at gender diversity and then ethnic diversity, in the case of gender diversity, what we found is that the more women there are on the executive teams of these companies, the higher that likelihood of outperformance. So when we compared, companies across these sort of three different levels of gender representation, so those that were in the sort of bottom third that had, 0 to 10% representation on the executive teams. And this, by the way, the specific analysis is focused on the UK and the US. Those that had, between 10 and 30%, and then those that were 30% and above. What we find is that those companies that were the most gender diverse, so with 30% and above representation of women on the executives, were up to 48%, or 48% and above, more likely to outperform those that were right at the bottom of that. And when we unpack the data, we actually see some patterns that reveal that this is indeed goes beyond just the benefits of pushing for gender parity. And this is a theme that is more than just, so those organizations that see this as more than just a tick the box exercise, so where this is really a strategic lever in how they think about their team composition and appointments to senior roles, that outperformance increases. So this is more than a one and done or tick in the box exercise. However, that notwithstanding, the progress has been relatively slow. When we look at how these representation levels have changed across boards and executive teams, both for gender as well as for ethnic minorities, there's been relatively slow change over the years. I'll maybe just explain what you're seeing here on the chart, and I'll focus on the right-hand side to talk about ethnic representation. So, the sort of black lollipop that you see there, that represents the representation on the board, and in the blue is representation on the executive team. So, as at 2019, we see that the composition was 17% and 13% for ethnic minorities on the boards and executive teams in aggregate for these companies, and that there was a 1.1 and 0.8% per year change in that representation over that 5-year period. So relatively slow, and not much faster when we talk about gender representation, slightly higher, 1.1 and 1.3% per year change, but overall slow. And if we kept at that pace, it would take something like 29 and 24 years respectively in the US and UK to get to gender parity, which is one might say an unacceptably slow rate of progress. Something else that the data also reveals that would warrant also retention of the executive teams here is that, when we look at gender representation, only about a third of the women executives in these US and UK companies were in what we could call line roles, sort of roles that are more tied to operations, like operations or the COO role or marketing, which are the roles that are generally more likely to translate into a CEO or other, much more senior executive role in the organization as compared to the staff roles. And so there is a gap in there to be addressed as well. What is interesting and is that the penalty for those organizations that are the slowest movers on these inclusion and diversity topics on representation has actually widened. So the business case effectively has grown stronger. So, when we looked at the difference in likelihood of outperformance, between those that were in the first and the fourth quartile, in 2014, that gap was a 9 percentage point gap. That has actually widened now to a 19 percentage point gap. So there is a widening polarization between those that are the leaders and those that are lagging. In fact, when we look at it in a bit more detail, we see 5 main cohorts for how companies are progressing on this topic. And this relates specifically to the 2014 to 2019 period. So on the left-hand side, we show the 5 different colors there, the different kinds of companies. I'll explain what you're seeing on this chart. On the vertical axis, what you are seeing is how much of an improvement they've made in percentage points, whilst on the x-axis going across is what their starting point was. So what was their amount of representation of women on their executive teams, executive and board teams at the time. And what you see is, in the top right-hand quadrant, you have the diversity leaders. These are those companies that already had a stronger starting point with higher representation or composition of women on their executive teams, but have also made the strongest improvements as well. And then in the bottom left quadrant is the laggards, those that have the least or lowest representation, but have also made the least progress, either remaining flat or in some instances actually declining. We also have those that we just look at these in terms of what a share of the data set they represent. The diversity leaders are a relatively small group, a small cohort of about 5% of these companies, while the laggards are one of the larger ones, 28%. And then there's those in the bottom right, resting on their laurels, that had a stronger representation to begin with, but have made slower progress. And there the impetus is to use, some reflection on how to use their starting points to build and grow even further. And we see a similar pattern as well when it comes to ethnic representation. I will turn now to change gear, to talk a bit about what organizations can do to address this. And I'll start by sharing an example for that one company has done. UPS, I guess, really in the US, very relevant and pertinent given the growth that we've seen in the delivery and logistics space in the wake of the crisis. They've taken a specific approach for how they've thought about diversity and inclusion. It first of all starts with getting the right leadership attention and focus in the organization on this. And that is, in their case, they've actually established dedicated roles, dedicated task forces that are responsible as part of their human capital strategy for thinking and executing their diversity and inclusion initiatives. There is a theme around ensuring that they're keeping close to the pulse of the organization. So using the annual employment engagement survey to really understand what the impact of the interventions is, so measurement. There's also thinking more broadly about not just what they can do in the narrow footprint of the confines of the walls of the organization, but actually thinking more broadly about the impact they have across all of their spend base. So in this case, thinking about their supply chain, and there's an initiative that we've had for many years now, where they've looked at how they can broaden diversity, how to think about their supply chain, and how to bring in additional partners to make a difference there. There is also what they're doing externally, which is making public commitments and backing that up with putting their money where their mouths are, with making grants outside to organizations that are making an impact, so getting that multiplier effect in the communities that they're in. But then also, internally really empowering their people so that, they're helping on the professional development side in terms of ensuring folks have sponsorship. We know that sponsorship is the lifeblood of professional growth and development. So there's a huge focus there in making sure that all of their senior leadership are devoting effort, time, and energy to sponsoring more junior colleagues, and that they are networking and learning opportunities for all, in particular their underrepresented groups. So that's one example of a company that is tackling this topic. It's important to reflect on one additional thing, which is that inclusion goes beyond just diversity and is really actually a different concept. Diversity talks about representation and being able to pull in from the diverse talent pool that our local community has. However, inclusion goes beyond that. It's actually about building an environment that's enabling for all colleagues to realize their full potential. And it's about thinking through what it is in the work environment that may be a barrier or maybe barriers to people, as well as really thoughtfully engaging to ensure that everyone feels welcome, equipped, and empowered to be their best and to contribute their best to the organization. And when we looked at this, we find that a lot of the discussion on diversity generally has a positive framing, but there's a much lower share of comments or discussion on inclusion that has a positive sentiment. So it is possible to be a very diverse organization, but at the same time, to not have an environment that is inclusive. Very important to really reflect on both of those as semi-independent concepts. We'll leave you with a couple of reflections. So, what can organizations do to make a real difference in this regard and to make real change? 3 themes. The one is setting the right level of aspiration. So being bold. That requires that top leadership are fully bought in, that they're committed, and that there is strategic decision made to prioritize inclusion and diversity and to link it to the strategy. So it's, as the analysis and results that we show here demonstrate, that this is more than just something to do because it's a feel good thing. It is not only the right thing to do, but it is also a real value creating lever. The second theme is around taking action, doing so in a clear and concerted way. So, having all of the disciplines and rigor in how we implement and execute, having the right sort of structures and governance to ensure that things are actually getting done the same way that we would do so for any operational initiative that we would drive. It's about building a well-structured inclusion program where we are clear on what the targets are, we're clear on what the aspirations are, who's doing what, when, the timing, the sequencing. Also, getting the multiplier effect by engaging with the supply chain, engaging with the community, and to make the most makes the most difference. And then the last one is about accountability. So, holding yourselves accountable and showing progress. Going into the internal systems and processes to understand where there may be inherent bias, whether that's in recruiting, whether that's in professional development, in sponsorship, or other areas in the business. about using real data and in real time to actually see what difference you're making. And that's from a range of different things, taking pulse surveys within the organization, looking at what the data says on recruiting, looking at what the data says on professional growth, advancements, etc. And having clear metrics for all of these areas that we can track. In the 6 areas that I want to highlight here are recruiting, making sure we're actually bringing in talent in the first place, retention, which is once we've actually brought people in, are we keeping them? Advancement, are we growing and developing them? And ensuring that we've got full representation, there's fairness in our compensation systems, and there's inclusivity in the internal culture. So I'm going to pause here and just stop sharing. And yeah, hand it back to Candace, and happy to take any questions.
Wow, you've made such a compelling case for inclusivity and diversity in organizations. Thank you for all of that rich content and the data that really points in the direction of inclusion and diversity. I'm going to turn it, Mukani, now, if you don't mind, to a few of the questions. We had one about things that can be immediately implemented. I think you sort of addressed that in your wrap up. Is there any other sort of quick, practical, sort of immediate, recognizing that some of the sort of larger scale changes, like say human resource policies coming into effect, might take 3-6 months, a year? Is there anything that you say that somebody that really wants to sort of hit the ground running on this later today can start?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And the way that I would think about that is that even in those areas like recruiting, where there's a natural cadence and that's potentially a bit of a lagging indicator, a lag to when we will start to see results, the things that you can start doing are immediate. We can literally sit down and have a conversation and ask ourselves, hey, what talent pools are we tapping into? Which schools and universities are we going to look for talent? And is there any implicit bias in those? We're going to the schools that we happen to have gone to because we're partial to them. We think they're great schools, but implicitly then ignoring other talent pools. So that's one example in recruiting where we might only start to see the results in 6 months or a year from now, but we can actually start taking action now. Let's look at how we do our screening of resumes. What our interview practice looks like. Are we actually calibrated in how we evaluate candidates, or are they implicit biases in how we have a partial preference for certain things, which mean that certain people that look or sound a certain way are just likely to filter through. Similarly, on the professional development side, we could literally start immediately doing an exercise where we understand what do our sponsorship maps look like. Let's actually go and talk to their people. Let's go and find out across various calls people in the organization who are their sponsors and what's the degree and quality of sponsorship they have and where are they. That's something you can start doing right away. And the same is true for having an impact beyond the organization. So, there are a few priority areas where you could start partnering with stakeholders in the community to take action. So I think my overall message on this would be there are absolutely lots of things to do. There's a prioritization exercise that's important, but you can start taking action pretty quickly.
Right. And so now, all the results you've shown, that inclusivity and diversity are distinctly and directly correlated to higher financial performance. How about compensation? Do companies tend to pay less for women and people of color while they enjoy these improved financial results? And what are your thoughts on where we sit on this?
Yeah, so, if you think through to one of the earlier charts, the facts show that, and obviously this will vary by industry and in specific organizations, but in broad aggregate, the data shows that in the case of Canada, speak specifically here, Black Canadians earn less than their non-Black counterparts. And I will make a bit of a detour and caveat to say one of the challenges that we face on this topic is the dearth of data. How sometimes it is not as straightforward as we would like and as it should be to actually tackle these challenges with the depth of analytical rigor, that we can other challenges and that we would want. But all the same, even with the limited data that we have, we see that Black Canadians, for example, earn less than white Canadians, and that is really consistent across a wide range of industries, across different roles, etc. And there's further unpacking to understand what's the driver of that. Is that just that it's more a question of Black candidates and colleagues don't progress as much in these organizations, so they don't get to the senior roles? Is it a question of there's just more simple discrimination in that for the same roles and for the same levels of skills, there are disparities in income? There'll be different things, and I think any objective and sincere effort that wants to tackle these questions will, confront the facts as they are, try to understand what's driving it.
Right. And now you've shown great data about the success of companies with women on their exec teams. Do you have any data regarding other gender identities, either non-binary, agender, the gender fluid? Is that data available? And is there anything you can speak to on that front?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for this specific analysis and these reports that we did, this was just focused on women in the case of gender representation and in minorities. One of the challenges that you face when you're trying to do exercise of this scale, we had 1,039 companies here, all over $1.5 billion in revenue per year, is that it can get more challenging to do that analysis at that level. However, what I would hypothesize is when we think and consider the challenges that intersectionality presents, the additional burden that diverse profiles and candidates face across race, orientation, sexual orientation, and other factors, that just compounds. And so, you would almost expect that it's just an additional layer of challenge and complexity that makes those representation sets even worse.
Yeah. We have somebody, Susan here, has said that Knowledge at Wharton today argues that it's dangerous to sell the equity, diversity, and inclusion case based on positive business returns, as data is correlative and not causative. They argue that the best case is a moral case and that businesses should just embrace diversity because it's the right thing to do. What do you think about this argument?
Look, my personal stance on this is I will happily take all and any arguments that advance the cause of better equality, better representation, building environments that enable and empower people to be their best and to be themselves. And my view on this is any and all arguments should be brought to bear on what is a very complex topic. There's going to be subsets of the community and the audience that are amenable to one set of arguments and others that are more amenable to a different set of arguments. I think we need all of them. And I absolutely agree. First and foremost, some of this is just basic human dignity, and that in and of itself should be a compelling case and reason for us to be addressing these questions.
Yeah, recognizing, I'll just quickly, I recognize we're already over time, and I know this is a really interesting topic, and we probably could be here for days talking about this. It's taken years to get to this point to even create this data. So I will say that somebody that I have been connected to in the US who used to work for the US Department of Energy under Clinton's administration and is very well-heeled in sort of the communications perspective. He often talks about this, uses the example of gay marriage. And until the narrative was shifted from tolerance, which is a moral narrative, until it became about equality, they just didn't get anywhere in terms of, so I think, yeah, there's a morality piece there. This is just my sort of own opinion going on Dr. Joe Rome's thoughts, but that's idea of sort of morality and that people sort of believe they're moral, but when it comes to taking action, it's sort of, it has to be driven to sort of bottom line, at least initially. And from there, I think we'll get, some of the morality will sort of seep in, certainly into business practices.
Yeah.
Our next question, though there is clear empirical data about the benefits of I&D, what are the hindrances that keep companies stuck in the status quo?
That's a great question, and also a tricky one. It's I think a myriad of things. I think there's, first of all, just a part of this that is, if people don't prioritize this, if people don't believe or think this is important, if people don't even conceive that there's a problem, you actually can't start making progress. And that also ties back to, if we aren't even measuring it, and we actually don't have the facts to show what the issue is and how bad it is, and if there isn't an articulation for what that gap is, it, I think, contributes to hindering taking cohesive and decisive action to address it. But on top of that, so this is very closely related to the previous point on, we should be bringing any and all tools to bear in this dialogue. We should be bringing the rational, fact-based, objective arguments about the value that this creates. We should be bringing the moral arguments of why this is just basic human dignity question, a reason to be addressing this, and a host of other arguments. So, because there are many things that hold that hold us back, kind of make the status quo as difficult to challenge. Some of it is, people stuck in old ways and old rhythms. You've gotten comfortable with doing things a certain way, and we necessarily associate a friction and an activation energy with doing things differently. Why should I eat different cereal? I've eaten this, for the last 10 years, every day. This is my rhythm and my ritual. It's worked for me. I don't see a need to change. There's some activation energy that's required to get people to change.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that friction piece, like until sort of the discomfort comes to the point where that is more uncomfortable than the sort of discomfort of making the change, is sort of where you activate. But it's exciting to see what's happening. It's great to have reports and data like this from McKinsey. We have another question. Does McKinsey have a supplier diversity program to support marginalized groups and enable economic betterment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what are we doing? We do indeed. You may have come across our 10 actions we announced in the summer of last year that McKinsey publicly committed to on a range of dimensions, internally focused as well as externally focused, to tackling racial equity and injustice. Everything from internally focused around how we can build and double our leadership over the coming years of underrepresented groups, how we can enhance our the impact we're having in communities through pro bono work, direct contributions to organizations making a difference, partnering with and building in our supply chain and network of vendors, more diverse organizations, and using that as a tool to build new players, strengthen existing players. So it's a bold set of commitments, ones that we've committed publicly to, and that we're holding ourselves accountable to. But again, the theme and message there is it's multifactorial. It's not, there isn't one silver bullet. You actually have to be thinking across a multitude of dimensions, internally as well as externally.
Yes. Someone commented, we can't improve it if we cannot measure it. I think we're coming up to time, so I'm going to start to wrap this up. I think, in short, what you've told us here is that, outperforming companies are those that recognize the value of inclusion of diversity, and the business case for that is stronger than ever. Indeed, from what you've shared, Mukani, it's the strategic unlock as we begin to emerge from, pandemic status, and will prove to be the competitive advantage for organizations that will succeed in the recovery phase and beyond. I'd argue that organizations that don't address gaps in this realm won't remain successful by any measure in 5 to 10 years from now. They just simply won't be competitive, not only from a bottom line perspective, but from my lens where I work on brands and brand equity, I think the brand equity will start to diminish if companies don't move boldly forward in this direction. And as you said, as McKinsey's done with the public commitments to action, we are, as I said at the end of the last session, we're in a show your work moment in time, and it is sort of all hands on deck. And as you say, from all directions, we need to be moving towards this. I think it's also important to connect the dots, as you did when you started out with this, Mukani, on the sort of educational accessibility piece, and how that's sort of tied to sponsorship and bringing up, and this idea of feeling welcomed, equipped and empowered. And that does start with education. So it starts even before somebody walks in the door for an interview. How do they even get to that interview point and to be available? Because the question I know often comes up is like, well, the pool doesn't exist. And I know you have comments on that. We don't have time to get into that today, but the report is available online. Kelly Drennan, our Executive Director of Fashion Takes Action, has put it in the comments. The recording of this will be available in about 48 hours. fashiontakesaction.com is a resource for that and many, many more things. I'd invite you all to dive in. If you've enjoyed this today, there are monthly Wear series happens, always on exciting and dynamic topics in the areas of fashion and sustainability. You can follow at Fashion Takes Action on Instagram. And if you represent an organization or brand, here's my little sort of board member plug, that may want to get involved with Fashion Takes Action, we always welcome that conversation. Of course, we wouldn't be anywhere today without the sponsors for today, BDC, Business Development Bank of Canada, and Stringer LLP. So we thank them for their sponsorship. And we thank you, Mukani Moyo, for your time, your wisdom, all your insights, and really sort of, I think, unlocking some new information for some people, validating other information, and really giving us some action points to go back into our organizations, to make those organizations better, make them more competitive. And, through it, we're all on this path to make the world a better place. So this is, we're in an exciting moment now, and I'm really excited to see that companies are moving forward in this way, and McKinsey's helping to propel them with the data and the insights to support that. Thank you.
Thank you.